Hello and welcome to OLLI at Berkeley's Friday special events series. We're happy you could join us. Today, we will be hosting Ken Alex. And if you do have questions for Ken as he goes through his talk, please put those in the chat and we will field those a little later on in the talk. So today, the talk is called The Hard Part, Turning Climate Solutions into Policy at Scale. Ken Alex is the Director of Project Climate at UC Berkeley Center for Law, Energy, and the Environment. Ken was a Senior Policy Advisor to Governor Jerry Brown and the Director of the Governor's Office of Planning and Research. Before joining the Brown administration, Ken was the head of the California Attorney General's Environment Section. So please join me in welcoming Ken Alex.
Thanks, Matt. Good morning, everybody, and thanks to OLLI and for everybody being here this morning. It's a rather important moment for climate change and for the world. So what I want to talk about today is primarily about how hard it is, even when we know what the appropriate solutions are, some of the difficulties in actually getting those solutions to be put in place. And what I'm going to focus on is probably what I think of right now as the most important short-term action that we need to take on climate, which is around methane emissions. But before I get there, I want to talk a little bit about sort of the overall scheme of how we deal with climate change. Hopefully some of this will sound familiar because it's what California is trying to do and much of the world is trying to do, at least to some extent, and just give you a little bit of perspective about the overall climate change approach that is necessary. So I see my slides slipping around, but we'll get to those in a minute. One thing I want to start with, I'm sure you're seeing some news coverage of the Conference of the Parties, the UN meetings that are going to start taking place over the next couple of weeks in Glasgow, Scotland. It's COP26, which means it's the 26th annual meeting since the original meeting of the parties. This is a UN-sponsored event, so it's 195 nations that get together annually to talk about what to do. For many of the years, it's been primarily talk. 2015 was the Paris Agreement, the most important one of those meetings. This year, we could talk, I could spend the whole time talking about the COP itself, but this year, one of the big focuses will be on methane, which is, for me, music to my ears. I've been working on methane issues for at least 10 years, and it's finally reached a place in the world where there's a lot of focus on it. And that's part of why I want to use that as the example of how difficult this will be. But I want to start in a different place, as you can see from this slide. If we go back 15 years and think about where we've been, there's actually at least some reason to be a little bit optimistic. 15 years ago, wind was just coming into its own, and solar was really pretty much of a blip. California had almost no large-scale solar. And over the last 15 years has dramatically expanded. Wind has increased a fair amount, and worldwide, the cost of wind and solar has completely, dramatically been lowered. Now we're starting to see some of the same trends in electric vehicles. Hertz just ordered 100,000 Teslas, which is sort of incredible, given how quickly that's occurred. We're really starting to see some similar trends in energy storage, particularly batteries, but other storage technologies as well. And we always put cell phones on this list because the first iPhone was produced in 2007. And so that is 14 years ago. And think of how your life has changed in 14 years around a cell phone. All right, let's go to the next slide. This is, just really a reminder that things can change quickly. So don't despair, keep at it. What I want to do now is to go through and just to set the stage to talk about what I'm calling the 7 pillars of climate action. You can think about this in some different ways, and different jurisdictions, different governments, different NGOs think about this somewhat differently, but this is really how California has laid it out, and it covers most of the bases. So I like to talk about it in this form. And so just to run through this fairly quickly, this is another set of topics we could spend quite a lot of time on, but to run through it quickly, the energy sector and the transportation sector, to go a little bit out of order of how I've listed it here, represent about 70% of emissions. That's true in California, and it's true in most of the world. And transportation, as we've reduced, particularly in California, we've reduced emissions in the energy sector. Transportation is a very large percentage, maybe as much as 50%, depending on how you calculate it. We're doing well in California on the energy sector, and that's somewhat true in the rest of the world, although not quickly enough. California is well on its way to converting its energy system to ultimately 100% or close to it, renewables, non-emitting sources of energy. California has some big benefits or advantages because the energy system, a lot of it comes from hydropower. We don't have coal in California, et cetera. But at any rate, we're doing very well in the energy sector. The transportation sector, we are not doing so well. Californians travel about 300 billion vehicle miles a year. That is, even with the pandemic, is not really seeming to change. And so we need to do a lot more about converting transportation to electricity. And part of that is Governor Newsom's order in California to end combustion engine sales by 2035. And the rest of the world is starting to move in that direction. There are some big movement in that, to get there. There's a lot more to talk about transportation, but I'm going to move on to the building sector. Also an area where we need to do a lot more. Just to use the California example, there are about 14 million existing buildings in California. Most, if not all of them, need to be retrofitted to reduce their energy usage, to switch from natural gas to electricity, et cetera, et cetera. That's a very big lift. It's been slow. Voluntary actions have been really lagging. Even when it makes financial sense for buildings to convert, they often don't. And so I suspect there'll need to be a lot of new policies to change that. Given the amount of building around the world, if you think about China and India, the building sector could overwhelm the climate system, depending on how buildings are built and how much energy and other usage they get. The next pillar here is one that is, I think, underrated, and I'm going to talk more about it. SLCP stands for short-lived climate pollutants. The 3 primary short-lived climate pollutants are black carbon, hydrofluorocarbon, and methane. Methane, my favorite, which I'll come back to. The importance of these, it turns out that they represent about 45% of global warming forcing. CO2 being, of course, the primary global warming gas, but these others are hugely important. And if we, because they live in the environment for a much shorter time than CO2, CO2 will last 100 years or more, methane 12 to 15 years, and hydrofluorocarbons and black carbon a shorter amount of time. So you can actually not only get the benefit of the reduction of the emission, but you also get the pollutants that in the atmosphere will be taken out of the atmosphere and give us some additional time. So I'll come back to that shortly. Let me now move to NWL. Sorry for the acronyms. NWL stands for Natural and Working Lands. Again, using California as an example, a hugely important segment of the climate change set of responses that we need to do. In California, we, as you may have noticed, have forest fires, and that produces a very significant amount of greenhouse gases and black carbon. And in addition, natural and working lands are a place where carbon is sequestered. But right now, our natural and working lands, and when I use that term, I think of forests and wetlands and agricultural lands. Right now, primarily because of fire, but for other reasons as well, our natural and working lands are sources of emissions rather than sinks, and that needs to be turned around dramatically. This particular category is related to the next category, carbon sequestration. As I mentioned, soils and natural and working lands are a place to sequester carbon. But there are other routes to carbon sequestration which are going to become more and more important because of our inability to seemingly to cut emissions sufficiently. So methods of carbon sequestration include direct air capture, systems that are starting to become, I won't say prevalent, but there are now a number of systems and facilities around the world that look like a wall of jet engines that actually capture carbon, CO2 directly from the air. And then there are various things that you can do with that CO2 once you capture it. That could be another whole talk for a later time. But because we are really not doing enough to reduce emissions, our ability to sequester carbon becomes more and more important. So it can be done in sequestering, can be done through direct air capture, it can be done through geologic storage, it can be done through natural and working lands, it can be done through ocean sequestration as well. And then finally, inevitably, we also have to do adaptation. We're just simply not, as we can tell over the last few years, we're subject to all kinds of new and interesting weather patterns and very big natural events, bigger hurricanes, droughts, et cetera, all of the plagues. And we need to figure out how to build resilient communities and to adapt to the changes that are inevitable. So that's the very fast run through 7 pillars of climate action. And let's go to the next slide. So I want to switch gears here, but actually one thing I want to say before I talk about methane is for each of the topics and pillars that I just ran through, there are many promising climate solutions. And that's important to know because there's incredible work being done at Berkeley in California, around the world, And some of these solutions are amazing. It actually makes me hopeful on a daily basis as I see what's going on. But it's not easy to move even the most promising climate solutions. And so that's where I want to switch gears and talk about methane. Methane is really probably the biggest opportunity to make climate gains in the shortest amount of time. And I mentioned one of the main reasons for that, which is because it lives in the atmosphere for about 12 to 15 years. So if we act now and we get rid of methane emissions, not only do we stop adding to the atmospheric load, but we also remove a whole bunch of methane from the atmosphere, and it gives us a little more time. The estimate, if we reduce by 30% of methane emissions from 2020 levels by 2030, we will actually reduce warming by about 0.2 degrees Celsius, which may not sound like a lot, but since we're aiming to keep warming below 1.5 degrees Celsius, 0.2 is a pretty big chunk of that. Methane accounts for about 25% by itself of human warming, maybe more. And it's really a place where we can make quick progress is the word I'm looking for. But here's where methane emissions come from. This chart lays it out. A surprising amount is from agriculture. I'll get to that in a second. I want to start with some of the other categories. Oil and gas, as you can see here, is about 25%. Coal, and then mostly waste in some form. Agriculture, I've broken out because it's kind of interesting. Enteric fermentation refers to basically cow burps, is sometimes another way to refer to those. What comes out of the front end of the cow. The back end of the cow, in this chart, it says manure management about 3%. I actually think it's somewhat higher than that, but it's, I guess that's 3% of the total here. But at any rate, yeah, so it's about 7% of agriculture. And enteric fermentation is something like 50+%. And interestingly enough, rice cultivation is a very large percentage of methane emissions as well. All right, so let's go to the next slide. All right. Well, before I get to that, you can go back if you can, otherwise, yeah. So one of the things that you'll see if you pay attention to the COP this year, the Conference of the Parties in Glasgow, is that the US and the European Union have sponsored something called the Global Methane Pledge. And there'll be an announcement, but so far what's been announced is that the 9 of the top 20 emitters of methane have signed on to the pledge. The pledge is a 30% reduction by 2030. And I suspect that there'll be further announcements of quite a number of countries that have signed on. This is very hopeful for the reasons that I've expressed. But let me talk for a minute about how we proceed. So the obvious place to start here is with oil and gas. And the reason for that is that methane is natural gas. It's a product. And so to the extent that you can capture methane, particularly in the oil and gas operations, then you can resell it. And so there's really very little excuse for methane emissions in the oil and gas industry, because if they invest in capturing the methane emissions, they simply turn around and sell it. So not surprisingly, the first focus of methane emission reduction is in the oil and gas sector. And there's progress being made, but you can imagine that it is more difficult in a place like Nigeria, where there's a big oil and gas industry, than in a place like California for reducing methane emissions. That's in no small part because regulations and controls are more limited in places like Nigeria than they are in California. And so one of the questions is how do we promote the actions necessary to control emissions in Nigeria. And let me give you another example. One of the biggest country emitters of methane is Turkmenistan. Turkmenistan has a robust natural gas resource, and most of that is sold to China. But Turkmenistan is very, very sloppy in its operations and has a very substantial emissions leakage of methane through their natural gas systems. So what do we do about it? Turkmenistan is probably not that interested in cleaning up its act, short of either incentives of some sort or some reason to need to clean up. So in that case, with Turkmenistan, the obvious approach is to see if China is willing to either take action in conjunction with Turkmenistan or say they will limit imports from Turkmenistan if methane emissions are not reduced. Is that possible? We don't know, but it's certainly a place where, in thinking about how we reduce methane emissions, we want to work with China and see if they will participate in that discussion. And that's, gives you just a sense where you think that it might be easy to get oil and gas emission reductions. It's not necessarily the case. The same is true for coal. As you can see by this chart, coal mining represents about 9% of methane emissions. That's a lot. We know what the technology is to reduce methane emissions from coal bed mining. It exists, and California, for example, oddly enough, has a rule for how you do it, or a set of technologies. I say oddly enough because there's not a lot of coal mining in California, but we know how to do it. A lot of the coal mining is done in China and India. And so again, what are the tactics and strategies to get China and India to pay attention to the methane emissions when they're using coal as a very significant source of energy? These are political questions, and I'll get into a little bit of that in a minute. So that's oil and gas and coal. The other two categories are, as noted, are primarily waste and agriculture. So waste is interesting. You can see in this chart, it's broken down in a number of ways. Municipal solid waste, meaning landfills, is about 11%. And we know how to control methane emissions from landfills. It's primarily the breakdown of organic material in those landfills. So the two things that are necessary to deal with those emissions are to reduce the amount of organic material that ends up in landfills that can be used as compost, which has other benefits. If you use compost on soils, you actually increase the soil sequestration, the carbon sequestration in soil. But you can also cap landfills, and there are technologies to do that, but those are expensive and they take expertise. If you think about municipal solid waste, landfills exist in almost every jurisdiction in the world, rich and poor, and the controls on those landfills vary quite dramatically. So thinking about how you reduce methane emissions from landfills, it's a very complicated problem. It's a financial problem. It's a jurisdictional control problem. It's got all kinds of aspects of difficulty and complexity in thinking about, how you might control landfill emissions in an island in Indonesia. Every one of those islands where there are people has a landfill. So that is some of the complexity there, and it's something that we're trying to think through because it represents a very significant amount of methane emission. And now I want to turn to agriculture, which is the largest sector and in a lot of ways the most complicated, because there are these at least three separate different sources of emission: enteric, manure, and rice. Each of them requires a different set of solutions. And if you think about it, within each of those, you're going to need to do some different things. So in California, most livestock feeding units are done through CAFOs, the confined animal feeding operations, where you have a large number of cattle, for example. And those operations produce wet manure. It's a long discussion of why that is, but wet manure produces more methane and can be treated through a dairy digester. But in much of the rest of the world, cattle and livestock are handled differently, and if they're grazing cattle, then you have dry manure. The good news there is that it produces less methane, but you need to come up with a different system to handle those methane emissions. With rice, it turns out that methane emissions are impacted quite a bit by the timing of flooding of rice fields and how the rice itself is planted. And so there's a lot of study in all over the world about how we might handle changing some of the techniques for rice cultivation. This is a very tricky problem because rice is a hugely important crop in much of the world. And if we screw up the rice cultivation, then you create all kinds of additional problems. Having said that, there's some very good research about how we might reduce methane emissions from rice while not impacting or even increasing yields. So there's good possibilities there. And then with enteric fermentation, there's, in fact, for those of you in the Bay Area, there's an article today in the San Francisco Chronicle looking at a commercial study and pilot around red seaweed as an additive to cattle feed. And they're finding that it reduces enteric fermentation and methane emissions from cows by over 50%. If that's the case, and that there are pilots and studies around the world, it's very encouraging. There are different feed additives that may be possible. But if you start to think about that, how do we get, let's say that this is a really viable solution. How do we get those feed additives to be adopted in places as diverse as India and China and California and everywhere in the world that has cattle. And those are the sorts of challenges that we have with methane emissions. Okay, so let's go to the next slide and talk a little bit more about some of the barriers. I've hit on a lot of these, but these are among the things that in thinking about large-scale climate solutions that we really have to overcome. And I put political will at the very top. And I think, unfortunately, we'll see a fair amount of this problem at the Conference of the Parties in the next couple of weeks. There'll be some nice rhetoric. There'll be some commitments to spending more money on the problem. And then the follow through will be less than dramatic, and there'll be certainly outliers like Brazil and to a certain extent Australia that are unwilling to move forward. And in the US, we have an entire political party that still wants to do little or nothing on the topic. Corporate power, complacency, inertia, different ways of, the system is slow to change at best, and we're running out of time. Endlessly, there's regulatory and judicial delay that we see on a regular basis. Of course, we value due process, but these processes take a very, very long time. And it's expensive, at least some of it. It's more expensive to do nothing, but that is a much harder argument to make. We're seeing some amount of leadership. The US is trying to return after 4 years of denial to some level of leadership, but the disputes between the US and China are causing spillover into the area of climate, and there's endless sets of issues in trying to get to large scale solutions and to try to do them quickly. So it is a challenge for sure, but I don't want to leave it in that place. So let's go to the next slide. All right, I don't have a slide for my optimism, ironically. But let me talk a little bit about why I think methane solutions are on their way. There are a number of efforts to put low orbit satellites into space. And the reason this is quite interesting and relevant to methane is that JPL, Jet Propulsion Lab in Southern California, developed an optical instrument that allows us to see methane leaks. And California has used this instrument for overflights with airplanes. And then JPL and its partners were able to miniaturize the instrument so that it can be placed on satellites the size of a breadbasket. And that effort has turned into a partnership between California, JPL, Planet Labs, which builds the satellites, and funded by a number of foundations, and including Bloomberg and High Tide and a few others. And those satellites will be in orbit in probably mid to late 2023. There's also another satellite system that will work nicely together with the one I just mentioned that the Environmental Defense Fund is putting together, and will be in orbit in the similar time frame. And together, those satellite systems will be able to identify much of the leakage of methane from every jurisdiction around the world. And what that will allow us to do, and California has done this to a certain extent with the airplane overflights, is to, first of all, identify some of the largest leaks. And it turns out that because methane is colorless and odorless, that sometimes facilities don't realize that their methane is leaking at all. And California was able, with simply a few phone calls, to get a number of significant leaks closed based on the information they got from these overflights. So that's number one. And then number two is identification through satellite data of leakage will allow jurisdictions to really focus on particular, what are the highest volumes, and where should we be spending our time and money to reduce emissions. So once we get that data, there will be the ability to do much more focused action. At the same time, a series of foundations, philanthropists, and donors have come together and have already raised about $250 million for action to take place and deal with methane emissions as quickly as possible over the next 3 years. As this data becomes available, they want to be in a position to fund more action, to do pilots like the red seaweed that I mentioned, and other approaches for different parts of the world that have different sets of issues. And so there is a fair amount of work being done on this, and focus, which for me I feel like it's somewhat overdue, but here we are. And I think this combination of having data and then having funding is kind of new and different and exciting, and I think is going to create some significant possibilities. So I think I could go on for a while on this, but I think I've been seeing a number of questions pop up. So rather than continue to talk here, maybe it would be best to see if we can take some questions and go from there.
I can. Thank you very much. We do have a couple of questions. Thank you for touching upon the COP26. I think all of us are thinking about that for the next 2 weeks and, waiting to learn more. Do you have a sense around what's going to happen with President Biden's bill and the 500? I mean,
yes, I completely know what's going to happen.
Oh, all right. Yeah.
Kidding. I'm sure people have been following it. There's a lot of climate-related money in both the infrastructure bill and the Build Back Better bill. So if those manage to make it through Congress, there will be, something like $500 billion over the next few years around a series of climate investments. These are a very big deal. On the methane front, the U.S. EPA has in place or in process a number of regulations to reduce methane emissions from oil and gas, and initially in particular, but others as well. There were things in the original proposal for Build Back Better that have been taken out, which is unfortunate. But I don't think I don't want to underestimate the value of what's still in Build Back Better. I think some of the provisions that were taken out would have moved us more quickly, but I think there's a very substantial amount in there. So hopefully in the next couple of weeks, we'll see some progress on that.
Thank you. Let's get to some of these questions. Les Gugliassi has asked, what's your view about reducing or eliminating diesel fuel used for backup generation and using natural gas or renewable gas captured methane, is renewable natural gas, as a substitute?
Well, that's not surprisingly, Les, that's a very good question. Diesel, for a lot of reasons, really needs to be phased out. Depending on how it's combusted, it can generate quite a lot of black carbon. Black carbon promotes a greenhouse heat, and there's a lot of reasons to want to get rid of diesel. Particulate causes all kinds of health and safety issues. Now, what do you replace it with? I am not a fan of expanding our use of natural gas under most circumstances. There is a big effort to produce renewable gas, and interestingly enough, you can actually produce methane from captured CO2. And that is a process that's in its early stages of development, but it would be at least a fairly neutral way to produce power. And so I think there's a fair amount of work being done on that, along with things like green hydrogen. It's not clear what will replace diesel and in what form, but I think, as I mentioned, there are a lot of possibilities, and I think one or more of them is likely to become prevalent, and diesel hopefully will be phased out.
With Les's question, I'm wondering, with new leadership at San Francisco's public utilities, do you have more hope with public utilities and more hope with PG&E?
Well, those are kind of a mix of questions. So San Francisco is in the process of integrating a community choice aggregation system, which is going to change probably more quickly than PG&E would do, moving towards 100% renewable. So that's in process, and there are a whole series of CCAs, as they're called, around the Bay Area, and Sonoma and Alameda, et cetera, and they are moving more quickly to renewables. So I expect that to be the case in San Francisco as well. What the relationship between the city and PG&E will be going forward depends a fair amount on how quickly the CCA expands and is integrated. And that's a longer discussion.
Okay. It also calls to mind whether or not, how is the Bay Area regional government, there's the entity, which I'm now blanking on their name, have they been instrumental in any of this?
You're talking about Abag?
Yes, I am talking about Abag, yes.
Yeah, they're a lot of what Abag does, they have a big role in transportation and housing. I really didn't touch on that too much. That is a huge issue for natural and working land. So, obviously the state and not just the state has a housing shortage, and how we build out really impacts many things. It impacts open space, it impacts agricultural land, it impacts density and transportation. And so Abag is very important to the overall Bay Area scheme. And there are a couple of important reports out recently around how they see the Bay Area transportation and Bay Area build out and preservation. So they are quite important to this overall effort.
Well, that's good to hear. Tim Landish asked the question, are there recent authoritative findings that enteric fermentation produces less methane than earlier studies have found? You had mentioned, that many things are coming forward, and I think many of us did read about the algae additive, to the food. And it makes you wonder if that has a greater chance, since so many people identify with and are on gluten-free diets as a result, that we might have some chance just because of its associative power.
Well, enteric emissions are tricky from what I understand. I'm no expert on this, but I've tried to learn as part of what we're doing. We're actually helping to build a protocol for how you reduce emissions in agricultural for agricultural emissions, and enteric, as noted, is the largest source. I'm not aware, Tim, of this study showing that enteric is less than previously thought. There's a lot of work being done right now in different additives, and the California dairy industry actually is one of the leaders with this, which is great. But there are different approaches. There's a Swedish company called Mutrol that their additive is around garlic and oranges. Red seaweed is noted as from some work done at UC Davis. One of the things that it needs time. Unfortunately, it's going to take a while to figure out how effective these approaches are, because the ruminant system of the animals can adapt to the changes in diet, and what might reduce CO2 initially by quite a large percentage over time may not be as effective. So there may be you may be required to rotate different additives, or, and of course additives produce different may change the taste of milk or meat, and that could have implications. So it's a tricky area, but it's super important because of the very high percentage of emissions that result from enteric.
Doug Mandel asks, what do you think is the role or the prospect of large-scale regenerative agriculture?
One of my favorite topics. We started a program called Grizzly Corps. It's an AmeriCorps program that sends recent grads to agricultural rural communities to work on regenerative agriculture. I'm really interested in regenerative agriculture. It's a little bit of the usual conundrum between how you approach it. Is it small scale operations, family owned farms? Can we integrate it at a larger scale? Well, there's a lot of research showing that different regenerative techniques, no-till and cover crops, and some of the other techniques associated with regenerative ag, which tends to improve soil retention and absorption of carbon, and also increase the ability of crops to grow at a faster rate, which increases uptake of carbon. Can these things be integrated into large-scale agriculture? I believe that at least some of them can, and that even large-scale agriculture can increase carbon sequestration. Danone, the French agricultural giant, and the Mars company, and Nestle, and many of the large agricultural companies right now are working with a fair amount of acreage to try to see if there are things that can be done. I'd say so far it's a little too early to know at large scale how this works. I think we can see at smaller scale organic farms and farms that are using regenerative techniques are seeing really good results. One of the key things about regenerative agriculture, though, is that it's really site dependent, and you have to sort of be adaptive in how you manage the crops and the land. And whether that's possible to do at large scale, I don't know.
Gregory Chan asks, he's on the board of the local League of Conservation Voters. He wants, from your point of view, what individual actions, solar power for our homes, what individual and collective actions for people rather than corporations or governments do you suggest move things along most effectively?
Yeah, well, since the League of California Voters is the perfect entity to ask the question, because my response is the absolute most important thing to do is to vote for candidates that are going to do more, and to vote against candidates that are not. And we have not yet made this a political issue in the United States. I'm not aware of, I would say any, but there may be one or two elections that have been decided in any way by the climate issue. And, kind of going back to where the environmental movement started in the early 1970s, the movement made a very big point of challenging senators and congressmen who were not perceived as supporting environmental causes, and they knocked a couple of them out of office, and that changed the political tenor. We have not had that around climate, which is shocking in some ways, and people do not seem to vote yet on the climate issue. So to me, that's the absolute most important thing to do. There are, quite a lot of other personal lifestyle things, and diet is certainly among them. But I think, to me, the political piece of this is the most important.
Ken, we're going to try to get two more questions in. In this before I get to the two questions, is there an environmental group that still does scorecards on the voting records of state and national survey?
Yeah, I believe so. CLCV changed their name to, I think they're now called Environmental Voters, okay. And they do a scorecard. And yes, PCL, I believe, does as well.
Okay, and PCL stands for?
I knew you were going to ask me that. Conservation League.
Great, thank you. So, all right, so I'm going to ask the nuclear question, and then I'm going to ask you the philosophic question. But the nuclear question comes from Daniel Fishman. What is your view of the role of nuclear, of hydrogen fusion?
Yeah, so in California, the answer is pretty easy, because we really have almost no nuclear power in our system, and so we don't need it. As we build out, between solar and wind and hydro, California's energy needs can be met without nuclear. But there are hundreds of thousands of megawatts of power that are coming offline in the next 10 years that are from nuclear. And it is concerning that there may not be an obvious way to produce clean or at least GHG-free power without more nuclear. So I am not a fan of nuclear, and I, like to see some breakthroughs on energy storage, which would allow us to avoid additional nuclear power. But I have to say that I think at least to some extent we probably need to at least consider more nuclear power, and the possibility, given that there, some of the smaller nuclear plants and newer technology seems to be safer than some of the older. On fusion, fusion, the joke is it's always just 10 years away from happening. I follow it with great interest because I find it absolutely fascinating, and the science is amazing. And there are reported some breakthroughs recently, but I'm dubious. It's been 10 years away for 50 years, so we'll see. Did I lose you?
We did lose Susan, but she relayed her philosophical question to me, and that was, is it too late?
Yeah, that's a great question to end on. What I would say is no. In some form, we're gonna figure out how to survive and to move forward. It's too late to have no impacts, as we're already starting to see. It's too late to avoid some very significant impacts because more is coming. It's already built into the system. But there are lots of solutions that can be ramped up. That's why I started where I started with the iPhones and solar and wind. I think we're going to see that for battery storage, and I think we're going to see that for electric vehicles, and I think we're going to see that for direct air capture. And if those things can move quickly, I would say the unfortunate thing is that a lot of this is now technology dependent, because I feel like the political will is just going to be too slow. But I think there are reasons that we can turn this around and make progress sufficiently quickly to avoid the worst. So I'll be reasonably optimistic.
Sounds great, Ken. Thanks again for coming, and thank you all members for showing up. Just a quick reminder, we have our winter showcase at 1 p.m. today to learn more about our winter classes. So please check your emails and check our site for that. And I did put in the chat the links from Ken's final slide for Grizzly Core, Project Climate, and Climate Break. So you could look at those quickly, or just remember those names and look them up on the web. Once again, thank you, Ken, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks a lot.